Imagine your smartphone resting on your nightstand in the middle of the night. The screen is black, notifications are silenced, and as far as you are concerned, the device is asleep. You bought this hardware with your hard-earned money. You pay a monthly fee to a cellular provider for a specific amount of data, perhaps 5 gigabytes, maybe 10, or even an unlimited plan with a hidden throttle cap. In your mind, you are the sole owner and the primary user of this technology. However, while you sleep, an invisible drain is occurring. Your device is wide awake, engaging in a silent, constant conversation with servers thousands of miles away. It is sending packets of information using the data you paid for, without your explicit permission, and often without your knowledge. This is not a glitch or a rogue app. It is a fundamental part of the ecosystem you carry in your pocket every day. At the heart of this digital mystery is a massive legal confrontation that has recently come to light. Google, the architect of the Android operating system, has faced a significant legal challenge that resulted in a $135 million settlement. This confrontation defines a crisis of trust between one of the world's most powerful corporations and millions of smartphone users across the globe. The core of the allegation is simple, yet profound. Google allegedly programmed the Android operating system to utilize users' cellular data to transmit diagnostic and telemetry information back to its own servers. This occurred even when the devices were completely idle, and even when users believed they had restricted such background activity. This legal battle took place primarily in the United States District Courts of California, but the implications are far-reaching, affecting every corner of the global Android ecosystem. For years, these practices went largely unnoticed by the average consumer. Most people assumed that if they weren't browsing the web, streaming a video, or sending a message, their data was safe. The reality was far more complex. The reasons behind this practice are rooted in Google's insatiable need for data to maintain its vast network of services, refine its advertising algorithms, and monitor the health of its global fleet of devices. By using the consumer's paid data plan to transmit this information, Google effectively shifted the operational cost of its data collection onto the users themselves. The discovery of this hidden transaction did not come from a corporate disclosure, but from the diligent work of cybersecurity researchers and whistleblowers. These experts began to notice that Android phones were communicating behind the scenes at a frequency that far exceeded what was necessary for basic functionality. They watched as devices, fresh out of the box with no third-party apps installed, immediately began reaching out to Google's servers. This was not the standard handshake required for an app update or a security patch. This was a continuous stream of telemetry, a digital heartbeat that never stops. For users on limited data plans, especially those in regions where every megabyte counts, this system data was bleeding their accounts dry. When we look closer at the implications, a multi-layered reality emerges. On the first layer, there is the simple fact: your phone is a reporting tool. Every few minutes, it checks in. On the second layer, the implication is more troubling. This happens regardless of your interaction with the screen. You don't have to touch the device for it to work for Google. On the third and most significant layer, there is a financial consequence. You are essentially subsidizing a multi-billion-dollar data collection machine with your own money. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This realization transforms the relationship between the user and the manufacturer from one of service to one of exploitation. The shock factor for many was the realization that low data users, those who carefully toggle off every setting to save money, were still being affected. They were doing everything right, yet their data caps were still being reached prematurely. They were fighting a battle against a system designed to bypass their defenses. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the total lack of transparency. People were being charged for a service that Google was the primary beneficiary of. This wasn't an accidental leak, it was a calculated design choice. Most people never realized that their free operating system came with such a specific recurring hidden cost. This choice was baked into the very code that makes your phone run. It was a silent monitor, a witness to your digital life that expected you to pay its travel expenses. But this wasn't just a technical glitch. It was a calculated design choice that most people never realized was happening under the surface of their sleek glass screens. The data being harvested wasn't just numbers, it was the story of your life, sent 1 kilobyte at a time. This was more than a minor technical oversight. It was a deliberate architecture that prioritized corporate data acquisition over the financial interests of the common user. While the hardware belongs to you, the software often answers to a different master, creating a conflict of interest that costs millions of people every single month. To understand how this invisible drain functions, we must look at the concept of telemetry. In software development, telemetry is essentially a digital heartbeat. Just as a doctor monitors a patient's vital signs to ensure everything is functioning correctly, Google uses telemetry to monitor the health of the Android ecosystem. These are background pings, small bursts of information sent from your device to remote servers. These pings check for various items: your current GPS coordinates, the health of the operating system, and the status of your unique advertising identifier. This last piece is crucial because it allows the advertising machine to know who you are and where you are, even when you aren't actively using an app. This leads us to a vital distinction that most users never consider: the difference between active and passive data usage. Active usage is what we all understand. It is the data consumed when you intentionally open a browser, watch a video, or scroll through a social media feed. In these moments, you are the driver and you understand that you are spending your data. Passive usage, however, is the system acting entirely on its own. It consists of the background processes that run without a user-initiated trigger. The idle problem is perhaps the most contentious aspect of the findings presented by researchers and whistleblowers. They discovered that even when an Android device is sitting perfectly still on a table, with the screen off and the user perhaps sleeping in the next room, the device is far from dormant. Data reveals that these devices send telemetry packets to Google servers hundreds of times every single day. The frequency is staggering. Some reports indicate that an idle Android phone communicates with Google roughly every few minutes. This constant chatter is a design philosophy unique to the Android ecosystem. While other mobile operating systems certainly communicate with their parent companies, the sheer volume and frequency of Android's background pings have been highlighted as exceptionally high. This isn't just about keeping the clock synchronized. It is a deep, persistent integration that keeps the device tethered to the Google mothership at all times. This unique connection ensures that Google is never truly out of the loop regarding your device's status, even when you think the phone is off. This brings us to the uncomfortable reality of free services. We often hear that if you aren't paying for the product, you are the product. In the case of Android, the situation is even more nuanced. You might have paid several $100s for the physical phone, but the software running on it is licensed to manufacturers by Google. To the consumer, the Android operating system appears free. However, this background data usage functions as a hidden tax. Every kilobyte of telemetry sent using your cellular plan is a kilobyte you cannot use for your own purposes. Over a month, these tiny increments add up significantly. When researchers compared a clean version of Android, one stripped of Google's proprietary services, against a standard phone integrated with Google Play services, the results were eye-opening. The phone running Google's services consumed significantly more data while idle than its stripped-down counterpart. This suggests that a large portion of the data drain isn't necessary for the phone to simply exist. It is necessary for Google's specific business model to thrive and expand. The sheer volume of this passive data is a surprising statistic that often shocks users when they see the breakdown. For many, background system data doesn't just represent a tiny fraction of their usage. It can constitute a significant percentage of their monthly data cap. If you are on a plan with limited data, say 2 gigabytes a month, and the system uses several hundred megabytes just to talk to Google, that is data you have effectively lost. It is as if you bought a gallon of milk, only to find that the store clerk comes to your house every night to take a few sips for themselves. You paid for the whole gallon, but you only get to use what is left. This realization shifts the narrative from technical necessity to a question of property rights. Privacy experts argue that this usage pattern represents a fundamental breach of the user's financial boundaries. This leads to what legal experts and the legal plaintiffs call the consent gap. When you first set up your Android phone, you are presented with a long, dense document known as the Terms of Service. Most of us scroll to the bottom and hit agree without a second thought. We want to use our new gadget, and we assume the terms are standard. However, the lawsuit claims that this fine print failed to adequately explain what was actually happening under the surface. There is a massive difference between agreeing to let an app use data to function and agreeing to let the entire operating system use your paid data to feed a corporate telemetry machine. The plaintiffs argued that Google never clearly informed users that their cellular data would be the primary vehicle for Google's own internal data collection. This lack of transparency is the bridge to a much larger debate about digital ethics. You might have clicked a box, but did you truly understand the cost? The legal team representing the users argued that the answer is a resounding no. They contend that the fine print was a shield used to hide a process that most reasonable consumers would find objectionable if it were clearly explained. mind. This gap between corporate policy and user understanding is where the legal battle was fought, and it raises questions about the very nature of consent in the digital age. You agreed to the terms of service, right? Well, the lawsuit claims the fine print didn't cover what was actually happening under the surface. The legal battle that followed these discoveries centered on a concept most people take for granted: ownership. When the legal plaintiffs filed their case in California, they weren't just complaining about a minor glitch. They were framing the issue as a fundamental breach of contract and a violation of consumer protection laws. At its core, the argument was that Google had misappropriated something that did not belong to the company. In the eyes of the law, a cellular data plan is a form of personal property. You pay for a specific volume of data. When Google's operating system used that data for its own telemetry without explicit consent, the plaintiffs argued that Google was taking the user's property for its own financial gain. This was not just about privacy, it was about the unauthorized consumption of paid data. To prove this, the legal team presented technical evidence. One piece of evidence involved background synchronizations. Experts testified the system performed complex tasks in the background to ensure that when a user opened an app, the information was already there. While sounding like a helpful feature, it was done using cellular data even when Wi-Fi was available or when the phone was supposed to be idle. Forensic analysis of log files showed the persistence of this tracking. Evidence showed that Android devices sent location and diagnostic data even when the user had manually toggled location history to the off position. This suggested that user choices were systematically overridden by processes that prioritize Google's data needs over individual preferences. The legal challenge also highlighted the use of dark patterns within the user interface. These are design choices intended to manipulate users into taking actions they might not otherwise choose. Plaintiffs argued that setup screens and privacy menus were deliberately confusing. By burying the settings for background data usage deep within complex menus or using vague language, Google ensured that majority of users would never disable these features. This wasn't an accident of design. The legal team argued it was a calculated strategy to maintain the flow of data at the user's expense. When Google agreed to a $135 million settlement, the figure seemed astronomical. However, breaking down the settlement reveals a more complex reality. Much of such settlements is diverted to cover the immense legal fees incurred during years of litigation. The remainder is distributed among millions of affected users, often resulting in individual payouts that are barely enough for a cup of coffee. This raises a critical question: is $135 million a genuine punishment for a company with a market capitalization in the trillions, or is it simply a cost of doing business? To many privacy advocates, the fine was a drop in the ocean compared to the billions in advertising revenue generated by the very data being harvested. This legal drama is deeply personal. If you owned an Android phone, your data was part of this evidence. Every time you walked or slept with your phone nearby, your device was participating in this experiment. You were an unwitting participant, providing the raw material for Google's algorithms while paying for the privilege through your monthly bill. Your data cap was the fuel for a machine you didn't realize was running. Your phone was no longer just a tool for your convenience. It was a sensor for a third party, and you were the one keeping it powered and connected. The turning point came when internal Google emails were unsealed and presented to the court. These documents were the smoking gun evidence. The emails revealed that employees were aware of data drain issues long before the lawsuit was a whisper. Some discussions suggested that if users realized the scale of consumption, they might become agitated. These internal communications stripped away the defense that data usage was a necessity. Instead, they painted a picture of a company that understood the impact its design choices were having on consumer wallets, but chose to prioritize the harvest. This revelation of prior knowledge transformed the narrative from technical oversight to a corporate strategy. While the unsealed internal emails exposed a corporate awareness of the data drain, the actual financial consequences were felt far from the boardroom, manifesting in the quiet depletion of millions of data plans. This phenomenon is best understood through the concept of micro-theft. When a single smartphone sends a few megabytes of telemetry data to a server in the middle of the night, it feels like an insignificant event. It is a tiny fraction of a modern data allowance, often too small to be noticed by a casual user checking their monthly statement. However, when you multiply those few megabytes by the 2 billion Android devices active across the globe, the scale shifts from a minor technical byproduct to a massive transfer of resources. This is the digital equivalent of death by 1,000 cuts. For the average consumer, these invisible transmissions represent a portion of their service for which they have paid, but which they did not choose to use. The impact of this unauthorized usage is not distributed equally. For users in wealthy nations with unlimited plans, the drain is a hidden annoyance, perhaps only visible when a service provider sends a notification about reaching a high usage threshold. But for people on limited or pay-as-you-go data plans, the stakes are higher. In many developing nations, the cost of mobile data represents a substantial percentage of a person's monthly income. In these regions, data is not just a luxury, it is a vital tool for banking and education. When Google's background processes consume that data without permission, it directly subtracts from the user's ability to access essential services. For a student in a rural area or a small business owner relying on a hotspot, those stolen megabytes can mean the difference between completing a task or being cut off. This reality reframes the settlement not just as a victory, but as an acknowledgement of a systemic burden placed on those who could least afford it. Beyond the cost of the data, there is the matter of the hidden profit margin that Google derives from these transactions. Those background pings are incredibly valuable for refining advertising algorithms. By checking a device's location and advertising IDs, Google builds a profile of the user's habits and preferences. There is a profound irony in this arrangement. Android smartphone users are essentially paying providers for the data that Google uses to harvest their personal information. That information is then sold to advertisers who target those same users with specific marketing. The consumer is subsidizing the very machinery that monitors them. The passive data collected while the user is away from their screen is often more revealing than active usage, as it tracks the routines and movements that define a daily life without the filter of conscious interaction. This escalation of impact extends into the physical health of the hardware itself. Every time an Android device initiates a background data transfer, it must wake up the phone's modem. The modem is one of the most power-hungry components in a mobile device. Constant activity forces the hardware to remain in a high-power state, which leads to a faster drain on the battery. This creates a secondary financial cost for the user. Repeated charging cycles accelerate the degradation of the battery, leading to what many perceive as planned obsolescence. When your battery begins to fail after only a year or two, the cause might not be your own habits, but the silent, relentless work the device is doing on behalf of its manufacturer. The heat generated by these constant check-ins can also impact the long-term stability of internal components, further shortening the device's lifespan. Have you ever wondered why your data runs out 3 days before the end of the month despite your habits remaining unchanged? The answer might not be your streaming choices or social media scrolling, but the system itself working behind the scenes to fulfill its own internal directives. We have become accustomed to the idea that our technology should always be ready and connected, but we rarely consider the price we pay for that convenience. The financial loss associated with unauthorized data usage is a documented grievance, but as the legal proceedings have shown, it is only the tip of the iceberg. While your wallet was being thinned by a series of invisible transactions, the real damage was being done to something much more fragile and harder to quantify: your fundamental right to privacy. The shift from financial depletion to privacy invasion occurs the moment we examine what is actually contained within those invisible telemetry packets. To the average user, data usage sounds like a generic term for browsing the web or watching a video, but for Google, data is a forensic map of a human life. Privacy experts and cybersecurity researchers, the primary whistleblowers in this case, spent countless hours dissecting the code to reveal that these background pings are far more than just system status updates. Each packet sent from an Android device acts as a digital thumbprint containing a dense collection of identifiers that define the device and its owner. This includes everything from specific device hardware serial numbers to advertising IDs that are uniquely linked to personal spending habits and interests. The researchers discovered that these packets are packed with a surprising amount of metadata that defines the user's entire digital environment and behavior patterns. Beyond these static identifiers, the telemetry includes highly dynamic information about the user's physical environment. Your phone is constantly reporting the signal strength and MAC addresses of every Wi-Fi router within range, even if you aren't connected to them. It reports which cell towers are communicating with your modem, allowing Google to triangulate your position with startling accuracy, regardless of whether your location history is toggled off. This creates a detailed log of your movements throughout the day, providing a granular view of where you work, where you shop, and where you sleep. When you consider that these pings happen hundreds of times every 24 hours, the resolution of this tracking becomes clear. It isn't just a general idea of your location. It is a minute-by-minute narrative of your physical existence, captured without user interaction. This leads to the persistent myth of anonymization that tech companies often use as a shield. Google frequently asserts that the data collected is anonymous and not directly linked to a specific person. However, the legal findings and expert testimony suggest a different reality. In the world of big data, true anonymity is almost impossible to maintain when the data points are sufficiently dense. Through a process known as de-anonymization or fingerprinting, researchers have demonstrated how easily anonymous data can be relinked to a specific Google account. By combining your location data with your device's unique hardware signature, the system can determine with near certainty exactly who you are. The data isn't just floating in a void, it is being fed back into a centralized profile that knows your identity, your connections, and your history. This persistence of tracking means that even when you think you are off the grid, the device is diligently working to ensure you remain a visible node in the network. The consequences of this data collection are layered like an onion, each level revealing a deeper intrusion. On the first layer, there is the simple technical fact that Google knows your phone's battery level, signal quality, and internal temperature. While seemingly benign, the second layer reveals that by knowing your location through cell towers and Wi-Fi signals, they can map your routines and travel habits. The third and most concerning layer is what this information reveals through sophisticated aggregation. By analyzing the frequency of your movements and the types of locations you frequent, Google's algorithms can predict your socioeconomic status, your likely political leanings, and even your future movements. They don't just know where you are, they can predict where you are going to be tomorrow. This level of predictive modeling is the engine that drives the multi-billion-dollar advertising industry, and it is fueled by the very data the Android smartphone users were never asked if they wanted to share. This reality transforms the Android operating system from a helpful interface into a silent monitor. It is a digital witness that never sleeps and never forgets. There is a profound psychological impact in knowing that the device in your pocket, the one you trust with your private messages, family photos, and health information, is constantly communicating with its parent company without your intervention. It creates a sense of being observed that most people only associate with extreme surveillance states or science fiction. Yet, as the privacy experts pointed out during the lawsuit, this wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. The Android ecosystem was built on the principle of constant connectivity, but that connectivity was leveraged to turn the user's private life into a profitable commodity. Authority figures in the cybersecurity community have long warned about this specific type of background telemetry. They pointed out that while users might feel they have control through privacy settings, the underlying architecture of the OS often bypasses these choices. These experts highlighted that the dark patterns used in the user interface frequently guide users toward giving more data than they intend, while hiding the mechanisms that allow for background harvesting. The legal plaintiffs argued that this expert testimony was a cornerstone of the legal argument, providing the technical proof that the data drain was not a byproduct of operation, but a core function of the harvest. As we look at the corporate defense, we begin to see how Google views these intrusions not as violations, but as necessary requirements for a modern, functional digital world, arguing that this constant stream of information is the lifeblood of security and stability. When the spotlight of the legal proceedings turned toward the glass walls of Google's headquarters, the narrative shifted from one of clandestine intrusion to one of technical necessity. Google's defense was rooted in a fundamental vision of how modern technology must operate to remain viable. Their legal representatives and technical experts argued that the background processes being scrutinized were not predatory mechanisms designed for theft, but were instead the very pillars upon which a modern, functional smartphone is built. From Google's perspective, an Android device is not a static piece of hardware that sits idle when the screen is dark. It is a complex digital organism that requires a constant pulse of data to remain secure, efficient, and capable of meeting high consumer expectations. The core of this corporate perspective rested on the essential services argument. Google contended that for a device to provide the level of security that users demand, it must maintain a persistent, low-level dialogue with centralized servers. They argued that modern digital threats are too fast for a manual update model to survive. Security patches, real-time threat detection, and anti-spam measures are not features that can wait for a user to initiate a sync. They require a background architecture that is always on, scanning for vulnerabilities and identifying malicious patterns. If a new piece of malware begins to spread, Google argued they need telemetry from millions of devices to identify the threat and push out a fix before the infection reaches a critical mass. In this light, the pings were described not as a misappropriation of resources, but as a protective shield, a necessary byproduct of safeguarding users from the far more dangerous actors lurking online. Beyond security, Google pointed to the challenge of system stability. Unlike competitors who control both hardware and software, Google must ensure Android runs smoothly on thousands of different hardware configurations. They argued that diagnostic telemetry is critical for understanding why a specific system process might crash on one model while running perfectly on another. This data allows engineers to identify hardware-specific bugs, optimize battery consumption, and refine performance for the benefit of the entire user base. They maintained that without this constant stream of performance metrics, the Android ecosystem would quickly degrade into an unreliable experience that would ultimately prove more frustrating than the loss of minimal background data. To bolster their position, Google leaned heavily on the industry-standard defense. They asserted that the background behaviors identified were not unique to Android operating systems. They claimed that every modern operating system, including Apple's iOS, performs similar background tasks to maintain health. By framing the issue as a universal trait of the mobile industry, Google sought to normalize the practice and argue that they were being unfairly singled out for standard procedures that are ubiquitous across the tech landscape. The debate, in their view, wasn't about the existence of the data transfers, but about what constitutes a reasonable amount. They argued that their data thresholds were within reason and that the benefits far outweighed the impact on data plans. This led to the philosophical part of their defense, the trade-off between features and privacy. Google argued that many modern conveniences users take for granted are fueled by background data. For example, the ability for Google Maps to provide an instant, accurate location is only possible because of persistent background collection. They framed this as a value exchange. The user provides passive data, and in return, they receive a seamless, magic experience that anticipates their needs. Regarding the $135 million settlement, Google's stance remained pragmatic. They viewed the payout as a move to conclude a protracted legal battle that threatened to drag on for years. In tech, such settlements are often seen as a necessary cost of doing business, a way to clear the legal horizon and refocus on innovation. They maintained that their terms provided sufficient notice, even if the implementation was not as transparent as courts required. As the legal battle moved toward its conclusion, Google promised a significant shift in policy, pledging to be more transparent. They introduced new privacy dashboards and toggles, attempting to show they were handing control back to the user. However, an open loop remains. Can a company whose business model is built on the collection of data ever truly stop taking it? While the interface may offer more buttons, the architecture still requires a constant flow of information. This tension between corporate necessity and privacy remains the defining conflict of the digital age. Following the formalization of the $135 million settlement, the landscape of the Android ecosystem underwent a visible and necessary transformation. This wasn't merely a financial transaction, it was a forced evolution of the interface between man and machine. Google, aware that the legal floodgates had been opened, began rolling out updates that prioritized transparency, or at least the appearance of it. The introduction of the privacy dashboard in later iterations of Android became a centerpiece of this new era. For the first time, users were granted a centralized view of exactly which applications were accessing their sensors, their location, and their data. This shift included more granular controls, such as the ability to grant approximate rather than precise location data, a direct countermeasure to the telemetry pings that had once quietly mapped out a user's every movement. This settlement created a profound ripple effect that reached far beyond the offices of Google, hitting the high-tech corridors of other giants like Apple and Microsoft. While their business models differ, the legal precedent established in the California courts was clear. Cellular data is a finite, personal property belonging to the consumer. Taking it without explicit, informed permission constitutes a breach of contract and a violation of consumer trust. This fueled a global right-to-know movement, where digital activists and ordinary citizens alike began demanding that manufacturers disclose the true operational cost of their software. The hidden tax of background data was no longer a secret whispered in cybersecurity forums. It was a mainstream concern that forced every major developer to scrutinize their own telemetry practices to avoid being the next target of a multi-million-dollar class action suit. For the millions of Android smartphone users, this moment served as a vital wake-up call. The realization that they had been unknowingly subsidizing a massive data harvesting machine sparked a transition from being passive consumers to becoming active owners of their hardware. People who had never looked at their system settings began digging into the data usage menus, discovering the toggles for background processes that had previously been buried under layers of submenus. This newfound awareness gave rise to a significant surge in interest for privacy-focused operating systems. Projects like Graphene OS and Lineage OS, once the domain of enthusiasts, began to see a more mainstream following. These alternatives became symbols of digital sovereignty, offering a clear path for those who wanted a smartphone that functioned entirely on their own terms without a constant, uninvited tether to a corporate mothership. On a broader legislative scale, the outcome of this legal battle acted as a powerful catalyst for international change. Regulatory bodies in Europe and across North America took the evidence of background drain and used it to sharpen the teeth of existing privacy laws. The General Data Protection Regulation and the California Consumer Privacy Act began to transition toward a standard where data consent cannot be buried in the fine print of a 50-page document. Lawmakers are now pushing for a framework where system-level telemetry must be an explicit opt-in choice rather than an obscure opt-out struggle. This movement aims to create a future where digital privacy is the default setting, not a luxury that requires a degree in computer science to achieve. As we reflect on this era of digital history, a fundamental shift is occurring in our relationship with the devices we carry. We are learning that the smartphone is not a static tool, but a living, breathing extension of our identity. It holds our memories, our financial records, and our private conversations. To treat such a device as a mere terminal for corporate profit is to disregard the sanctity of the personal space it occupies. Software is never truly finished. It is an ongoing dialogue between the creator and the user. Staying informed remains the only way to ensure that this dialogue remains balanced. We must move beyond the era of the passive consumer and embrace the responsibility of ownership, understanding that the convenience of modern technology should never come at the expense of our fundamental rights. The resolution of the $135 million lawsuit marks a definitive turning point. It proved that even the most powerful entities in the world can be held accountable for the death by 1,000 cuts they inflict on their users. Your phone is the most personal object you own, and it is time it started working exclusively for you. The settlement was a drop in the bucket for a company with the resources of Google, but for the global community of users, it was a massive victory for the principle of digital ownership. This wasn't just a story about megabytes and data plans. It was the opening chapter of a much larger conversation about the boundaries of our digital lives. The conversation has begun, and the power to determine the ending now rests firmly in the hands of the people holding the devices.